Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Amy.
So today we had a really great, well, they're all great recordings, but we had a really great recording today with Elizabeth Hamblet. And you're going to hear a lot of Amy giving her personal life up on the pod, which I'm grateful my kids aren't listening to the podcast because they'd be really embarrassed. But but she had a lot of really good advice about kids going off to college that had learning disabilities or dyslexia or ADHD or anything like that.
Yeah, I was actually surprised to learn that there were not accommodations for certain things like a college application process. I had no idea. So I learned a lot from her. A little bit about Elizabeth Hamblet. I wanted to share with you that she was actually a high school special education teacher for quite some time. And then she began working at the college level in the late 1990s. And then she started working in a disability services office as a learning consultant. So what's really cool about her is that now she has appeared in these numerous other journals and online platforms, sharing the knowledge that she's acquired through her job to educate people about special services that are available to children who have learning disabilities in college, and then those that are not available, and different things that people need to learn along the way. She also has 7 Steps to College Success as her book. She said she has a lot of free resources available on her website, ldadvisory.com. So she's a wealth of knowledge.
She was pretty wonderful. I really enjoyed our chat, as I do all of our chats. So let's take it away to the podcast with Elizabeth Hamblet.
Would you say you want to step into this episode?
Did I say that?
I'm using her book title.
Oh, okay. Well, let's step into this episode with Elizabeth Hamblet.
Thanks.
Bye. Hi, this is Amy.
And Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called
The Dyslexia Duo. So join us for our informative podcast, where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us. This is Amy.
And Melissa.
And we're the Dyslexia Duo. So today we have a very exciting guest that Melissa's been fangirling over her for some time. And so I was so excited to see that she had gotten her as a guest. So Melissa, do you want to introduce our guest?
Yes. So we have Elizabeth Hamblet, and she is a learning disabilities college consultant. Is that the correct terminology I should use for you?
Well, it's really a made-up term because there aren't a lot of people like me. So I think I call myself a college learning disabilities consultant, but certainly, there's no title police coming after me, I think. So.
Well, great. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, what brought you to your current career, and a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I started my career in this area of education back in the mid-1990s when I was a high school special ed teacher. And because I had only found a part-time job, I took another part-time job at the college where I had done my graduate work. And I really, really loved that work. And so one of the things that I realized, having just finished a master's at that place, was that all of my training was about everything that happens K through 12 under IDEA, understandably, because you folks know how encompassing that is, right? And then I was working at the college level and learning all sorts of things about how IDEA does not apply anymore. And even though you're under Section 504, you're under a different subpart and how the rules change. And so I became really interested in that work. and, moved out of state, took another job at a college. I'm now at my third university. And what I love about that work is I get to work one-on-one with students who are registered with our office, and I work with them on time management and organization, planning, reading, and writing strategies. As part of that, I also review documentation for students who are requesting accommodations through our office, and we can talk about how that process works later. And I developed a real interest, about 15 years ago in communicating to the K through 12 world of parents and professionals and students, if they're paying attention, about these changes, because what's so important about all of this is not to scare people, although I understand that's sometimes the effect, and that's not my favorite thing about my work. But I think knowledge is power. And I think it's so important for planning at the high school level to be informed by an understanding of what the next environment looks like. Because how else can you figure out, what skills to assess and then develop if students need them, what accommodations you might potentially start scaling back on after you've taught students the skills that they need to get them ready.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like you're doing a really good job at bridging the gap between the two areas, between K through 12 to college. And to me, this is something that our listeners have been asking us for. They want more information about the higher level. And I know we're going to go into more in-depth questions here in a little bit, but I really am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you, because this is something that Amy and I don't have as much experience with, dealing with the higher education. So I know that I will learn a thing or two. I know Amy is really eager to hear about this too. So I'm going to speak for you, Amy.
That's all right. You can speak for me. Well, I think what's interesting, going a little off script, I think what's interesting is that, and I made a joke in the last podcast, I have 3 children, chronologically adults, but, children. And college was a whole thing for us, because we may be paying the bill, but we can't go in there and mandate, hey, I need to hear from your professor. Because I tried.
Oh, sure.
They don't like that.
They do not.
They do not like
indeed.
that.
No.
And it's really, really hard to get all the things that we need to know, to have in place for our kids. And I can remember when my daughter went from a special ed label in her senior year in high school, and they said, okay, she's not going to have special education. She's going to have Section 504 when she goes to college. And I was like, what? I thought about it. I go, well, yeah, I guess all she's really going to get is accommodations. And I'm an educator in public ed for over 30 years, and that was mind-blowing to me, because that was something I wasn't aware of,
Right. So there is this big knowledge gap, and I'm certainly not the only person trying to fill it, but it's interesting because there was recently, and when I say recently, I came across it recently, maybe a year or two old, report from the General Accounting Office of the U.S. government about this, among other things, this lack of information coming down from colleges to high schools. And, I don't know how to explain why this chasm exists, like, why there's this information vacuum. It just persists. I've been doing this a long time. And I think there was another government report written 2007, 2008 about the documentation disconnect. So this is a persistent problem. And my only hope is that the more people who learn about it, they will share information to others. I find one of the most challenging things about this work is that there's actually a lot of misinformation going on. There are a lot of people who assume they know stuff. And, the central challenge of my work is I'm providing all this fact-based stuff, right? There's about a couple of dozen free blog posts on my website. I've got a YouTube channel with, lots of interviews and short informational videos on it. There's my book. There are my webinars. But if people assume they know, what would cause them to go seeking the information I've got available to them? And so,
right. That makes sense.
So I understand that. For parents and also for professionals, when you see information online, how do you vet it? How do you, critically assess what's there? Because people say, I've been doing this work forever, and, that may be true, but I actually work at the college level. I am in my professional community online all the time, looking at what my colleagues are saying about their policies, how they do things. And so People may have personal experience with their own children or with clients that they have worked with, but there's a lot of nuance to this work that I find lacking, when you see things online about the college environment and accommodations.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I'd like to think I keep my ear to the ground for things that are happening. I can remember one time I had a student that was dyslexic, and she was my student a long, long time ago, and she was going to a major university, and they needed proof that she was dyslexic. And I was like, oh, okay. And the mom says, they want to hear from you. I go, what, they want a phone call? I had her when she was in third grade. What do they want from me?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Surprisingly, they wanted a phone call from me and a signed letter with my credentials verifying that I had her. And I thought, how wonderful is that, honestly, because a lot of universities require reassessment of our students.
That is interesting. And what's important about that, and you've made that point, Amy, is documentation requirements vary across colleges. So documentation is just another word we use for paperwork. So when students enroll at college, and not before, that's the first chance they'll have to register with the Disability Services Office. And what's really important is to know that your high school special ed case manager is not going to and cannot register their students on their caseload for wherever they're going to college with their office. 504 case managers also can't do the same. The student must initiate and complete this process.
Yep.
So all of this stuff is online. You can find it for any university. You'll land on a page that says, here's what you do. And so part of the reason you can't do that until you're enrolled is very often they're just like in any industry, there are some commercial products that offices subscribe to. There are systems that students work through online platforms, is I guess what I'm using. And you need a student ID to even do that.
Yeah.
So students will fill out a form, and it's a good introduction to college. Nothing happens at college without a form. Housing, classes, financial aid. And we will ask questions, very many of us, things like, what accommodations did you use in high school? Sometimes we ask if they were helpful. Maybe we ask, just what accommodations are you asking for? And then we ask them to provide documentation. Now, here's what I wanted to say. I'm not sure if there are offices out there that do not require any documentation that will just accommodate students on the basis of a conversation. I'm seeing some comments in my online community. I do not know how widespread that is. I don't imagine it's very much so. So that's one end of the documentation spectrum. You just talk to the person at Disability Services, and if they agree that you are a person with a disability and find you eligible, you will get accommodations they deem appropriate. On the other end of the spectrum are the things that people believe are true and are true at some colleges, but not necessarily all of them. People think this is written into law. So you'll see online, oh, if your kid's going to college, they have to have testing that was done within the last 3 years.
Right.
That is true at some colleges. I've not seen a specific statistic for that, but it is true at some. And then there is a whole range of stuff in the middle.
Oh, wow.
So it's important to know that neither 504 nor the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the other relevant laws, say anything about documentation. And so as a result, in that vacuum of mandate, this leaves it open for colleges to make their own documentation requirements. So what's urgent about that is you shouldn't listen to anybody who tells you they know exactly what documentation your student needs at Hamblet University. You have to go to Hamblet University's site, check out my documentation requirements, and only then do you know. So what is challenging about that, as a lot of people know, is if it turns out that whatever your student has will not meet the requirements, and in a lot of cases, they're not getting accepted to colleges, some of them until May, right?
Yeah.
And school starts in August, it could be a very short amount of time to get something done. And so what I recommend is once students have put together their list, here are the schools to which I'm applying, that's a great time to go on each school's site, have a piece of paper or a document open, look at what each school requires so that at least you know what is possible. Now, whether the school district, the public school district will reevaluate your student if needed, is one way to go. If it's an ADHD evaluation, sometimes school districts don't have some of the assessments that colleges will require. It's too hard to summarize because it's all over the map. So it can at least be a good idea to get a sense of what will be needed so that you are like ready to spring into action once your student chooses a school.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Okay, so do those processes fall into line in what you recommend in your book, 7 Steps to College Success?
That's what I hope. So, this is my 3rd edition, and through these 3 iterations, we've changed things up a little bit. But I do think it's really important, as boring as it is, to start with the laws and the changes, because I do think that sort of sets the stage for everything else we're talking about. But it's also not just about disability law and how that things shift. It's about the expectations for college students generally. And I think sometimes in the disability community, and I use the word disability very deliberately, I know neurodiverse is also important, but if it's not a disability, it's not eligible for accommodation at the college level. And that is a really important distinction. I don't see disability as a negative word, and I don't mean to offend anybody who does. But there is one particular study, and there's just some anecdotes in there, but they looked at students who registered with their college's disability services office. First term, second term, third term, they were there. And with every term that a student waited, as an average, they had earned fewer credits and had a lower GPA. And so they did interviews with some of these students. And one of the young women said, I didn't know I had a learning disability. They kept calling it a learning difference. And I really didn't have any idea how it would affect me when I got to college.
Oh.
And that quote has really stuck with me. And I think it's in the book. So I tried to construct a pathway that starts with the background information that talks a little bit about what students' responsibilities are, because I think it's important to recognize that not only is your student going to go and have, if they want accommodations, and that's a choice they can make, that's part of that whole section about how they're going to access their accommodations, but just to be a college student. Like, you got to get up and go to class. Mm-hmm. You got to fill out the forms on time. And I think sometimes students have had a lot of second chances and flexibility from their schools. And it is important to know that that is not necessarily going to be the case, because what I want most is for students to go to college with the confidence that they can do all of this stuff that we are going to talk about. And if they don't have any experience with it and have some, failures and scraped knees, metaphorically speaking, before they get to college, not only does it mean they haven't perhaps developed the skills, but what I worry about is their own self-awareness, sense of self-efficacy, that if nobody's let them even try this stuff,
right,
that they're going to be very worried and anxious going into college, knowing they're going to have to be on their own. And I realize there are some parents there who are saying, Amy, to your point, like, I'm going to take care of it when they get to college. Mm-hmm. It's not always going to be possible.
Not at all.
And that's kind of a shock for kids going into the adult world. And we say that they're adults at 18, but we all know they're not adults behaviorally at 18. They still need a lot of support, a lot of coaxing, a lot of teaching about how to handle things that, if you were to just sign off and say, I'm done as a parent and throw them out, they would have to go through a lot of failures. And I don't think a lot of parents don't want their child to fail. They want their child to be able to be successful, but they walk into these colleges and the student has to handle so much of this on their own. Mm-hmm. And that is a big gap from high school, where you really are, like you were saying, you're still so supported and allowed to have second chances. And then you get to college and you're not.
Mm-hmm. And it's a big, the cost of failure literally is huge. Mm-hmm. It really is. Mm-hmm. And so I just put up a post yesterday on LinkedIn because it's, as we are recording this, it's the week of Thanksgiving and students are going to be coming home. And, I've been talking to my students for a couple of weeks already saying, finals are coming, finals are coming, finals are coming. Like, you got to get in that mode. You've got it, because a lot of them not a lot of my students, but a lot of students generally with and without disabilities haven't done all the work.
We have one that's in college that she's ADHD, but luckily she seems to have learned some coping and adapting skills, and she's already talking about her finals and getting her, because she's studio art, so she's getting her projects ready and her portfolio and all that. And so I'm super proud of her for having that drive.
Wonderful. So, when we talk about their responsibilities, professors are not required to ping them and say, this work isn't in, where is it?
Yeah.
That again is about the expectations for all college students. And sometimes people think that because their student has had, a case manager to do that, or the IEP required teachers to let the parents know when stuff was missing, that will carry on, or that it will transfer to professors having to communicate with students about missing work. And I want to be careful. It's possible that's happening somewhere.
Right.
I have no idea. I've never heard of it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But if so, I don't think it's common.
Yeah.
Now, I write a couple of columns a year for a higher ed journal. And there are some schools that have early warning systems for everybody.
Oh.
Right. So, and it's been a while since I wrote that column. I apologize. I don't remember the details. But, professors are maybe expected to put an alert into the system when students are doing well. I don't know if it's required for them to do that. And what was interesting was when I did those interviews, in some schools, it didn't go to the student. It maybe went to their advisor, who perhaps was going to ping them and say, I hear you're not doing so well. Here are some things you should do. But it's certainly not going to the parents.
Right.
As I recall.
Right.
And so it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's,
No, I remember, just like I said, being just shocked, because who's paying the college bill? Typically it's the parents. And I'm like, why don't we have access to this information? But it's because they're adults, And
it's hard. Look, you were joking about turning 18. With what we know about the brain's development, right? 18 is not really adulthood, right? And so in other countries, it's not typical to go straight into college. They may go straight into the military after high school, or they may just take a gap year because some other countries have figured out, hey, we should probably let that brain continue cooking for another year, but not here. And so just last week, my friends who are gap experts did their annual webinar. I will try to remember to send you guys the link for that, on gap experiences for students with LD and ADHD. And so it doesn't have to be that not only are you paying for college, but now you're sending your kid around Europe for a year. There are other ways to do this. But it's important to consider, sometimes parents in my Facebook group or, will message me online and say, well, I don't understand, Elizabeth, he's got ADHD, he's got LD, why are colleges like this? And the answer is because college is optional.
Yeah. True.
Is my best explanation.
Yeah.
Lots of, I think half the country doesn't go to college.
Yeah.
And so that's not officially a reason why we don't have to do some of the things that families would like for us to do, but it's my way of explaining why it's not required.
And honestly, I think my daughter has been successful because she is an older student. She did take that time. She didn't travel. Yeah. She just kind of stewed for a while. And I think that she's ready. I think she's emotionally and mentally ready to move on. She sees her friends have moved on and she's like, I need to get going with my life. I hear her saying that.
And I work with some non-traditionally aged students. And sometimes they did try college right after high school and it didn't work out. Sometimes they just, grew up in a community where college was not the expectation and they went to work and they've decided to do that. There's all ways, a very smart consultant I know said something like, going to college is not binary. Either you go right after high school or you do not go ever. And I think there are lots of communities where it's hard to remember that or hard to feel that way.
Right.
But yeah, and so when parents are saying to me, but he can't do that, he can't get himself up in the morning, all I keep thinking is, well, why are you sending him next year?
Right.
And to your point, Amy, especially if you're paying for it.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a student who starts at the local community college and proves to you that they're ready to spend your money, if that's the way you're rolling, by doing really well at that.
And that's where we started with all of our kids, was at community college. And I'm a child of the 80s, so I graduated high school in the 80s. And back then there was almost like a stigma by starting at community college first. Sure. And then my husband, who's over there, brought up a really good point. He said, it's not going to matter, because when they graduate from college, it's not going to say, but first they started at community college.
Right.
Such a good point. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. And also they're going to save a lot of money by starting at community college in a lot of cases.
Because there's a lot of failure with when they first start out. Yeah.
Yeah. If that's the case, and if not, then great. If they do well, and there are these, I think they're usually called articulation agreements between community colleges, and they vary from state to state, and the four-year colleges about what credits will transfer. So there are lots of good reasons to start. And again, I'm not here telling you that anybody who has an LD or ADHD or dyslexia, and this is the path. My whole point is there's a whole wide range. What's most important is for parents, and with the help of the professionals who know their student, to really suss out, is this student independent enough to go manage not just the academics, but the social requirements? Doing laundry so your roommate's not mad that your socks smell.
Right.
Yeah. So great. I love this. I've become friendly with a woman who calls herself the TikTok college doc, Jill Grimes. She's wonderful. She wrote a great book on health for college students. She's amazing. And she recently put up a post saying, hey, if you haven't done so already, it's a good time to wash your sheets.
That's the truth, isn't it? Oh my goodness.
Right. So, and manage those deadlines for paperwork. If you do not drop your class that you want to get out of before the drop deadline, it's going to cost you or your parents money.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence, and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents, because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Hi, this is Amy Rodenroth, one of the hosts of the Dyslexia Duo, and I want to tell you something else about my business, Discovery Dyslexia Services. I'm a Calc QI, and as a Calc QI, I'm able to train teachers to practitioner and therapist level using a dyslexia curriculum. If dyslexia therapy is a field you have been considering pursuing, I would like to encourage you to attend a no-obligation informational meeting being held via Zoom on February 1st. I will be discussing what a practitioner and a therapist is and what the requirements and expectations are as you go through training. If you're interested in attending this no-obligation virtual meeting, please reach out to me at my website, www.discovereed.com. That's spelled DYSCOVEREAD.com. Thank you. Let's return to the show.
Yeah, so I think you had mentioned that there's a quote on your Facebook page that said, just when I had figured out the IEP process, here comes college. And that's what a parent had said to you. And I thought that was so astounding that probably a lot of parents do feel that way. I wouldn't say a battle for every single person, but it is not easy to go through public schools with a child with any kind of learning difference, disability, any of those things. So I was wondering if you could describe some of the most important things parents need to know when they have a high school junior or senior and they're approaching the end of that K through 12.
Well, how much time do we have?
As much time as you want.
There you go. Well, I think, again, that's why I constructed the book the way I did. I think it's important to understand the differences in the mandates because, we move from entitlement to access as an emphasis. And what I mean by access, and this is what you'll see on some colleges' disability services sites, we have to provide access to our programs. And what that means is we remove barriers created by our environment that interact with your student's disability. And so, the obvious stuff is always sort of the physical plant stuff, right? We have to have rooms that are physically and bathrooms that are physically accessible to students who have those needs. We need to have in our dining services an appropriate range of food for students with medical conditions that need that. So when it comes to the academic stuff, that's where it feels a lot more intangible, I guess, right? And so it's about knowing those expectations, knowing what the accommodations commonly are, what they aren't. And again, looking at your student freshman year, and I kind of hate this because in a lot of communities, there is so much pressure on college, and we're talking to these kids at younger ages, and that's kind of creepy to me. Not creepy, but just awful to me.
It's weird. It is weird.
Let's let kids be kids.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to have that trajectory in mind. Where are we starting freshman year? What's in the IEP? What is the student, taking? What are they kinds of supports are they receiving? Nobody gets in a car and just thinks they're going to get to where they're going, right? You got to at least look at the route. You need to understand what's happening. And so if you don't know what that environment looks like, how accurate can your planning be? So back to the assumptions and the nuances of my work. So if you go onto a website, well, even a college's website, sometimes my colleagues are not as specific as I wish they would be. And if you see a list of common accommodations, it will say things like extended time. Well, there's extended time for tests, and that is something that when I say is commonly given, I don't have stats handy for that. But some people interpret that to also mean for assignments. And sometimes it will say specifically extended time for assignments, but here's what people don't often understand. So again, I have to start by saying there are more than 4,000 2- and 4-year colleges in this country. And I clearly don't know what happens at all of them. So I have, in my years of doing this, talked to parents who have said, and colleagues, who have approved extended time for, extended deadlines, whatever you want to call it, deadline extensions for students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and autism. What I can tell you anecdotally from my online community is of the people who respond when this comes up, the majority of them are saying that they do not. So why does that extended time for deadlines remain on these websites? Well, when we approve it, and that we is just meant to kind of be the average of us, if you will, it's for students with a specific problem and a specific time. So students who have mental health or physical disabilities that have unpredictable flare-ups at the time that they have something due and they are having a severe flare-up can usually request some extra time at that point. So it would be stupid of me to say nobody gets extended time for papers and projects because that would be a lie. It would also be stupid of me to say everybody gets it that requests it. It's not true. So these are the nuances that are missing from a lot of this stuff. And even those students who do get that accommodation don't get what we call a blanket accommodation where every time they have a paper due, they get extended time. Now, I have had people contact me in my group or wherever and say, actually, that did happen for my students. So the possibilities are out there. But the reason it's so important to know this is not for me to scare you and make you anxious, but to make sure that while your student is still in high school, they are learning how to manage their time. They are learning how much time it really takes them to get going. And they are practicing meeting those deadlines because there's a pretty good chance that is what will be expected of them. You know, Amy, you talked about your daughter being in an art school and creating stuff. So students in you know, certain science classes, the lab setup is not going to be available to them after a certain amount of time. And the makeups, you know, so it's not always that there's a practical reason why not. But when I talk to my colleagues and when they comment in our community, part of the reason we don't extend time is that what we're responding to most of the time is students who procrastinate. So it's not clear to us that moving a deadline changes the procrastination. It actually accommodates the procrastination, and that, you know, a lot of us don't think is useful. So, you know, students usually have at least a week to do something. And we don't expect them to spend 24 hours of all 7 days working on whatever this assignment is. And so the expectation is they'll manage their time.
Wow.
Yeah, and you know, I think taking it even one step further for the high school students, and Amy and I have talked about this on another show, where they attend their 504 meetings or their ARD meetings, and they decide as a group with their teachers, with their parent being present, what they really do need. And then the teacher could say, you know, I don't really see you using this accommodation, and kind of call them out, not to be shameful, but to just say, you know, you're really not using this. And that kind of helps bring light to the students' eyes that, you know what, maybe I'm not using this, or maybe I forgot about this accommodation. I should ask for this more. And that kind of trains them how to speak up for what they need, and also how to get ready for those instances in college as well.
Yeah. And, you know, as I wrote in the book, there are lots of different ways to prepare students to do that self-advocacy. You know, as we talk about special ed, we're supposed to individualize everything. I don't think there should be a one-size-fits-all approach to doing this, because I think running your own IEP meeting can be challenging for a lot of students in a lot of ways. And importantly, it doesn't echo the way we do things at college. That is, there may never even be a conversation your students have to participate in. So it may just only be filling out our form. And I have a free resource on my site. It's basically a practice form. Now, you can just look up any registration form that isn't behind the wall of needing a student ID. But if you do a search for university disability registration, you can, and I will try to remember to send you this sample form I've done, have them answer the questions of, what is your disability? When was it identified? What are the accommodations you're using? There are ways to develop that self-knowledge without it having to be a discussion. So in college, and this is so important too, maybe they're going to have an appointment with us when they register. That's called an intake appointment. And a colleague of mine got on Zoom with me a while ago and talked about those intake meetings. They are not interviews. They are, meaning it's not like a job interview where if you say the wrong thing, you don't get it. Right. They're opportunities for disability services staff to ask students more questions, maybe that came out of their, you know, reviewing their file. And importantly, he says, for them to ask him questions.
Yeah.
And I don't think people always see it that way. And so once students, assuming they are found eligible and get the accommodations they want, they probably never have to literally talk to their coordinator again. Everything's electronic. It's all email.
Wow.
So, and Amy, maybe you can speak to your students' experience, but essentially, once that's done, if they need accommodations for exams, most of the time, and this goes back to those forms, students themselves have to fill out a form that says, I have an exam in Professor Dean's class. It's November 15th at 2:00. And they have to get it to us 2 weeks ahead of time, because the amount of effort and time it takes for a disability services office, which, by the way, could be a single person or a couple of hundred students, to reach out to the professor and say, hey, Elizabeth's taking her exam with us. The professor has to make the exam up in advance. Professors procrastinate too.
Yeah.
So they are human beings.
Yeah.
So we need to put them on notice that actually they can't do it for this exam, so that they can get it to us, so that we can give it to the proctor and arrange for the room where the proctor is going to give your student that exam along with a bunch of other students taking exams at the same time. And those things don't happen in a day.
Yeah, my
That makes
child,
sense.
she submitted her accommodations from high school when she went into the college setting, but I don't think she doesn't advocate for herself well.
Okay.
And she won't tell the professor when she needs more time. And I said, she goes, they should have me on their list. I said, no, babe, this isn't how that works anymore.
No,
You know?
that's the thing, right? So what I meant to say, or where I was attempting to go, but as usual derailed myself, was that the research shows us that some of the reasons that students don't register with us, or as in the case of that one study, register later, and that happens at every school, no matter what. They want to shed their disability identity. They
Right.
don't want to be pointed out. They don't want.
They don't
think
want to be
it's-
different.
They don't want to be different. So the only people who know your student has accommodations are those who need to be involved in their accommodations. To your daughter's point, we are not sending out lists at the start of every term that go to every professor. And in fact, and again, this varies, for my colleagues who subscribe to that platform, or one of them, they will send an email at the start of every term to students saying, hey, are you still here? Because we don't know. This is not case management anymore. Our coordinators are not responsible for looking up the several hundred students on their list every term and seeing if they're there. They just send a mass email that says, hey, are you still here?
Yeah.
Or, I assume you're here if you're getting this. If you would like your accommodations, please log into our system. And depending on how it's set up, sometimes students have the ability to select which professors they want to get the notifications. They do not have to have all of them, and which ones they want them to know about. Now, I don't know that it's customized in that way everywhere. These are questions that students can ask when they're looking at colleges. And sometimes it's like the student's responsibility to press go or whatever it
Yeah.
is to get that sent. In other places, some of my colleagues send them out themselves, whatever it is. But none of that happens without the student.
Wow. Okay.
And so, or sometimes they'll get an email with a letter attached that they're supposed to send. And then we all want them to talk to their professors after they've given them the notification. And people misunderstand this, not to negotiate their accommodations, but essentially to troubleshoot them, if you will, to say, did you get the notification? Is there anything I need to know about how this will work? So again, they're not there to argue with the professor, and that is the chance for them. If the professor says, oh, I got that. Yeah, I don't allow that in my class. A, that's not how that works.
Right.
And B, it's not that we expect students to then argue with their students, but we don't know the professor has said this to them.
Right.
Because the idea that all these professors are going to email us back and say, oh, Elizabeth's in my class, you said she could have this, she can't. I hope some of them will, but I don't think students should rely on that. And that's part of that adulting in college. You have to look out for yourself because nobody else is doing that.
Right.
And then if they come back to us, and again, I describe this in the book, processes vary, but essentially professors cannot single-handedly say, that's not allowed in my class, case closed.
Right.
Is that happening? Probably.
Yeah.
Because students, taking professors at their word, they don't know how this is supposed to work. When students come back to us, or when professors come back to DS and say, oh, no, not my place, there should be a process in place to review that objection.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that professors' objections will stand because of their reasoning and what the accommodation is. And there will be situations where that is not the case.
Wow, this is all great information.
But they won't know until they say something.
Right.
And that is why we want them to do it. And so many of them don't. And again, I'm throwing that term, so many of them. I'm just seeing stories, it's anecdotal. But what I can see is a lot of them don't. And then maybe the professor, it says, everybody takes their test with me. They show up and they say, well, I got extended time. And that's when the professor says, oh, well, that's not going to work.
Right.
And now they're already at the exam.
Right.
And so it's a learning experience for a lot of them when that happens, but it is important. Again, you asked me what parents need to know. That's what parents need to know, is that this is what you're preparing them for. And so you want to make sure they have some role to play in all of this. If you are constantly emailing teachers with your students' questions or asking them questions, perhaps the better way is to, and everybody learns, teach your student how to write an email. Help them with it.
Yeah.
But have them do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Tell us what they learn. If you do it all.
Right. And kind of going back to what you said about that, taking some time off before they start college, I think some of that maturity process will really help them become better advocates for themselves, because, the older you get, the little more self-aware I think you become. And at least I noticed that with my own child. Like she noticed that she couldn't do online classes. It just wasn't something she could do, even though all of her friends are taking their classes online. She goes, I have to be there in person because I will zone out.
Well, good for her. And she had that self-awareness. And it can take some time to figure that out. Sometimes people don't figure it out until they've had a rough experience.
Exactly. This is the conclusion to episode 1 of our interview with Elizabeth Hamblet. Join us next week for part 2 of the interview with Elizabeth Hamblet and the Dyslexia Duo. The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Amy Rodenroth.
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at the Dyslexia Duo.
Email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends,
Family,
and teachers.
thanks for joining us.
Bye.